Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our MWF webinar. For those of you who are new with us today, our principal software, MWF, which stands for Metal Wood Framer, is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for light gauge steel and wood modeling. Today, our senior technician, Christina, will be doing an in-depth refresher on our wood software, covering template creation, shop drawing production, and the integration with BC Calc, and more. Just before we start, just like to remind you guys, at the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. To be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel, and please make sure that your computer audio is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All right, that's it for me. I'll hand off to Christina now.
All right, thank you, Tanya. Good morning, guys. So for today's kind of refresher webinar, I thought we'd cover some basic options in the wall module. Just to start off with, we'll cover some basic template creation, cover the wall joins as well, and then get into one of the newer options in the join feature that I'm not sure everyone's aware of. I'll touch on shop drawings a little bit too, and then we'll switch gears and take a look at two floor options, namely the blocking and the engineering that does come with the software. And I think that'll be a good overall refresher just on some general features. Like Tanya mentioned, if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask them live. No issues there. All right, so let's get started. So let's just start off with, again, the super basics of template creation. So as I'm sure some of you guys know who use the software on a regular basis, template creation is just the actual standards that you'll use to build up your panel. So there's a default wood one that does come out of the box with the software, and you kind of use that one to start building your own templates and building your own standards. So you can see here I've got my exterior 2x6 wall, and I'm actually going to use this one as kind of a base, and we'll make a new 2x4 interior wall template. So I'm just grabbing that one. I hit set as active to activate that template. And now I'm going to go ahead and create my panel. So whenever you're creating these templates, you want to make sure that you start off with at least one wall created, some kind of dummy wall, if you will. And then you can go ahead, come into the properties window, and start making any kind of necessary modifications that you want to do to this template. So like I mentioned, I'm going to keep this pretty simple, and I'm going to go ahead and make this a 2x4 interior wall. So I just have all of my lumber families loaded in already in this project. So let's change everything out over here. And the other main thing as well, I'm going to leave my spacing as is to 1'4". But any one of these options in here, if I did want to add in some additional blocking, put in some furring, it can all be completed within this miscellaneous tab. But like I mentioned, I'm going to keep things pretty simple. Let's do a 2x4 interior wall and save this as a template. So now to just go ahead and save it, I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. So that's going to basically apply these changes to my wall panel without me having to leave this window altogether. So now you can come into your projects tab, and I can go ahead and just hit save as. And now I've got my interior wall template to use throughout the project. So we could always go ahead and look in our template manager. You can see I've got that saved. I didn't have to apply those changes to that wall necessarily. I just had to use it. Again, it's kind of a dummy wall to go ahead and start saving my templates. So covered some pretty basic template creation, but the next thing I also just want to highlight is the template map. And this will definitely have some use, maybe to those of you with larger projects where you don't want to have to manually go through each individual wall and select which ones you want to use. You can just go ahead and build up a template map. So this is a great way, like I mentioned, just to link the templates once they're created to your actual Revit walls. So I just went in here, I created a new map already. And then it's just a matter of adding different wall types and lining that up with the templates that you have in the project. So I've got my interior 2x4 one over here. So what this basically enables you to do, once your template map is set, I have it activated, I can go ahead and say okay, and I'm able to grab multiple walls at once, say quick create this time, and then it'll frame out with the respective template. So I've got my interior ones using 2x4s, and my exterior walls over here are using 2x6. So that's, again, a nice little handy tool. And the next thing I'm just gonna highlight in here, and again, this might be particularly useful for those of you with larger projects, is this lock to template option. So if I go ahead and lock my wall in my map, I'm gonna lock that to a specific template. And what that means is that basically when I go ahead and maybe create, let's do this wall over here. I create another interior wall. This time this guy is going to be locked. If I do try and access its properties, it's going to give me this little pop-up basically saying that it's locked to a specific template. So this is where a nice idea of a dummy wall can come into play. Like I was mentioning, you can create maybe some separate walls off to the side of your project. Leave these unlocked. So you can make any kind of necessary modifications that you want to these walls. So if I go ahead and just create a free unlocked panel over here, and maybe I want to do a large global scale change, like changing the spacing. Can go ahead and update that template. So now I've updated that spacing to 2 feet. And because my interior wall here is locked, all I have to do is hit regenerate, and it'll update and take on that new spacing. So like I mentioned, it's a nice handy tool to have I can still make manual edits to the wall if I need to with Revit, if I needed to copy paste, maybe add on that extra stud here to cap off my wall. But you would have that option, there you go, with the lock to template as well. You can still make little manual changes, but the overall properties of that wall will stay locked. And as always, if ever you do want to unlock it, go in there into the properties, maybe make any changes. In the Edits tab, there's this option to lock and unlock your walls. You can always hit unlock. And then you're free to go into the properties and make whatever changes you want to that instance of a wall. So for my purposes today, I'm going to leave everything unlocked so I could always go into the panels freely. But again, for larger projects, it's definitely a nice feature. You won't have to keep tabs on all of your different wall types. So next, I thought I'd focus a little bit on the joins. So for the joins, can see naturally, I'm sure again, some of you who have used the software know this tool already, but Revit walls will naturally just overlap at their center lines. So you will get a little interference between the panels. So what you can do is go ahead and place a join manually. And the join configurations are just options that are loaded in with the software. You'll have a few defaults. They can always be customized to different join types. But these are the main ones that I can, in this case, pick for my T intersection. So I can place it manually and go through connection to connection. And then it'll just auto-generate with whatever join I've selected. But what I'm going to focus on is actually creating a rule for those joins to follow. So in here in the joins, there you'll see an option here to create an auto join rule. So I can go ahead and click that with my wall selected. The same steps kind of apply as placing a join manually. Just going to pick the one I want off of the list. In this case, I'll pick a pretty simple one. And the next step to that is you're going to save it to a rule set. So the rule sets are in here in your marker manager. There is a default one already that's present. But this is basically just a list where you can save all the different rule types depending on the join. So if you have different corner conditions, T-intersections, it could all be saved to one list, kind of like the template map is set up. So let's go ahead and select the auto join list that I have here. And then this is going to auto-populate with the wall types I have selected. So you could go so far as to say if it's a join between two particular wall types, the host 1 being my main wall. Host 2 will be the secondary wall. But for our purposes, I'm going to leave this as a pretty general rule for every kind of T-intersection. So that's where you can grab the host. You can go ahead and set the wall type. You do have the option of changing the wall types as well. But I'm going to go ahead and leave this to be blank. And again, what that's going to do is just create a general rule regardless of the T-intersection, regardless of the wall types that I have joined. So now that that's set up, again, if you did have a few different instances, you can grab a bunch of walls, highlight your entire project if you have the rules set up. And now I can go ahead and hit auto join. I'm going to pick my rule set. It'll join the walls together automatically, regenerate the panels. And I'll have my little arrow here denoting that there's a join at the wall. These are visible in a floor plan view as well. And if there's any kind of configuration based on the join, you'll be able to see that pretty easily in the 3D view. Or in the plan view, excuse me. Okay. So last option I'm going to cover in here in the joins. It's a kind of a newer feature that we've added recently. And this is to actually place a ladder. So if you do want to place an actual ladder join at your intersection, you can do that here now through the joins option without having to add horizontals in your panel, or you don't have to use the line command. It's going to be done pretty simply with this join option. So I'm going to go ahead, select my 2 studs, and I'm going to go ahead and just say place ladder. So you've got the option to create different types. I'm going to go ahead, select my family, place 2x6s. And then the options over here are pretty similar to the horizontal options in the walls properties. I could add it by ratio, put it in by offsets, and customize these however I need to. It could also, again, be done by ratio if you want to just put it in as a percentage of the wall. So if I want it every half point, 3/4 of the way, you could always put that in. I'm going to put this just as a general spacing rule. And this will run from the bottom up. So my first offset can be at 1 foot. My last offset from my top plate is also going to be at 1 foot, just to get that minimum clearance. And then I'll actually space out my members at 2 feet on center. And then off to the side over here, you just have different alignment options. You can see here if there is an intersecting wall that you'd like to place this. Well, you'll see the little picture shift. You could either place it flush with the structural layer, or you can have it include any other finishes if there is something running through the wall. And then you always have the option to orient the horizontals. So I'm going to go ahead and hit add. I'll have this option now. And once I say OK, it's just going to prompt you to grab the intersecting wall. And once that's done, I've got my ladder joint already set up. And it's basically placed those automatically. So it can be a pretty handy tool if you don't want to have to place these by marker line. You don't want to have to run through the panel's properties and place these. They could always be placed at an intersection or just between any two studs. If you did want to delete and place a new type of join, you've got that option here as well. And that's just going to remove it from the panel. All right. So last little option I'm going to cover in the walls actually has to do with the shop drawings. And for any of you guys who've produced shop drawings before, you know I can probably spend 2 hours alone on the options in here. But one of the main things I do want to highlight just for this refresher course is for those of you who have multi-layer panels, so you have panels with sheathing, as well as standard single layer panels. We've now merged basically both shop drawing engines into one cohesive engine. So now you can just have one list of view options, and you could have separate sheets for your multi-layer and your single layer. So you can see here in my multi-layer tab, I'll have a few extra options in here for sheathing. So I'll have a sheathing list. I'll also include the sheathing in my framing elevation. And then in the standard tab here, I'm just going to have my basic framing elevation, a cut list, plan view, and 3D view. So what I really want to highlight is that it's just 2 different sheets using the exact same view options. So basically, what this is going to enable you to do, let's go ahead and throw in a multi-layer wall. So I've just got my wall here now with sheathing. Sorry about that, guys. All right, so I've just got my wall here with sheathing, got my basic single layer wall, and I can grab both of these at the exact same time, run my shop drawing engine, and it'll create both sheets with one click. Oh boy, people are chatty today. Sorry, guys. Okay. So I let that generate, and if I go to each individual sheet, I've got my basic single layer one. Everything's labeled. I've got my basic cut list as well. And my multi-layer panel will have similar options, except this time I'm going to have an additional sheathing list. I also added in a section view. And my actual sheathing is going to be visible this time in my elevation view. So it's the same view options. I could now just use the same engine for both panels. All right. So last two options that I'm going to cover for today's webinar are actually going to be in the floors. So let's switch gears and go over there. So the first one in this panel off to the side, I'm going to go ahead and just cover how to place blocking in the floor here. And I think it's a pretty widely used tool, which is just why I wanted to touch on that. So first, before we place any kind of members, the actual bridging is going to be created through the project bridging types options. So right there in the tools. And if I go ahead and say create new, this is where you have options to add bridging, blocking. I could add a continuous member if I'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and just add the blocking. So from here, it's pretty simple. Once I've created my type, I just pick the family size I want to use, basically where it's going to place in my panel. If I want it aligned to the top, hitting the structural center line, or aligned to the bottom. Let's go ahead and also stagger these blockings. I'll just put a 1-inch stagger. And then for placement options, you do have options over here to place it either at the first or last bay between my joists. If I did want it to jump ahead and just start placing at the second bay or the third bay, I could always increase this and it'll only start placing my blocking at my third bay. If maybe there isn't enough room between your joist and your end joist, you could always leave these bays down to 0 as well, and it'll automatically just start placing in your first bay and continue on. So let's go ahead and leave it to 0. So I'm only going to get it between my interior joists. And then for that kind of placement, you can again have it skip every second bay, every third bay. You can just enter in the number that you'd like in here. But I'm going to want it between every joist. Last options for cutback configurations. So we are obviously dealing with lumber, so we can change our joist to be rectangular or a member to be rectangular. And then it's just a matter of which plane it's cutting back to. By default, we obviously want this to stop short and not run through the joist, so we're going to set that to plane 1. And then for actual placement, it's just placed by marker line. I can go ahead and drop that in. going to go ahead and assign the blocking type that I made. And then pretty similar to what we've seen, you can place this by spacing. You could have it start at a benchmark if need be. But I'm going to place my first line at 2 feet, and then it'll continuously place at 2 feet after that. So what that's going to give you are these marker lines. And for those of you guys who aren't familiar with this, marker lines are super handy. You can delete them just purely with Revit commands. They can be moved. You can copy paste them. And then when you actually hit regenerate, you'll have blocking wherever you have that line. So can be handy. The lines themselves can also be changed. So if you did have another blocking type that you wanted to switch out, you just have to select the line and hit its properties. So that's one thing I just wanted to highlight with the blocking in the floors particularly. It is done by marker line, but with those marker lines, it does give you quite a bit of flexibility. So just to wrap up today's session, I'm going to touch on the engineering slightly with the floors, and namely the option that comes out of the box with the software, which is BC Calc. We do work with Forte and Sizer as well. That uses their desktop add-ins, but BC Calc is the one that does come fully integrated within the software, so there's no need to download any third-party software. So that's the engine I'm going to leave as active. We have our different building codes in here. And if you did want to edit a list of presets depending on the material that you have available, you can always do that and filter out the sizes that are available in your area. But again, I'm going to leave this pretty broad, have all my inventory present. And something that you can also do with BC Calc directly in this integration is place Simpson hangers. So now that I have my basic configuration set, for the actual loading types, there is a default one that you can apply through here, but you can see I've already created a light design type, and you can basically add as many as you'd like depending on your loading needs. You can put in different magnitudes, and the deflections can always be changed as well. So any one of these options can be customized. So last thing I'm going to do before I go ahead and run my floor analysis is I'm going to go ahead and change the design. So I'm going to apply my light loading to my floor. And the other main thing I want to highlight before we go ahead and run the analysis is just the actual supports and how we pick that up when running analysis. So you can place beams. You can see here I've got my foundation walls supporting my floor. So that's just going to be directly picked up by how the floor is actually modeled. So if you did want any kind of internal supports or any additional supports, you just have to model those in with Revit. So the next step to this is to actually run the floor analysis engine. And the analysis engine is actually going to break it up automatically into different groups, just depending on the spans. So you can see here, I've got one separate group for my J1. You can already see it selected in the model, how they're going to be divided. And then again, you can go ahead and select which members, if any specific ones you want to use to analyze. But I'm just going to say use best analysis. It'll show me all the available options and different products that I'll have which pass. You'll also in here just have a load summary, and it'll also just show the spans. So let's apply all. So it'll apply my products to my 3 different group types. And now I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. And this is what's actually going to launch the analysis and then give me all my available design results. So again, it'll be broken up depending on the group, so the different sizes of joists that you have. I can click on any one product and get an overall little summary of my results, the moments, the end reactions, the deflections. And by going to this summary table, with the product that's selected, you can actually get a full BC Calc report, which will give you the loads and the complete breakdown of that joist. So once you make your product selection, here you have the option to design the hanger. And then again, just based on the groups that you can isolate and the products, it'll give you a list of hangers that you're able to select from. So depending on the start side or the end side of the joist, you can have different hangers. I'm going to go ahead and just apply the same hanger to each end for all group types. And you'll also notice here that my J1, if I jump to that, that particular hanger that I had selected wasn't applicable to J1, which is why I had my options here blank. So I could always go individually pick the hangers for one particular group. And all of your product selection is going to be summarized in here in the table. So once you're good to go, I'm going to go ahead and select my hangers, say OK, and then it'll actually load in those different families, so there's no need to preload anything beforehand. It's going to regenerate the panel, and it's also going to go ahead and place those hangers for me. Now, our hangers do come in as kind of a generic object, just so it doesn't slow down your model with too much detail. But they're labeled as is. They're included in the floor panel. So if you go ahead and run a shop drawing, you can get that in a takeoff. And the actual floor joists you'll see here have turned green, just to say that everything's passed. So that wraps it up for me today, guys. As always, if there was any questions, feel free.
Thank you, Christina. It looks like we have time to answer a few questions. If you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just please also make sure that your audio is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session has closed. As always, please feel free to share the recording with any colleagues. All right. All right, it looks like we have a question from Greg. Greg, I am just going to unmute you so you can ask it live. Go ahead, Greg.
Oh, hi. I was just wondering, we do mostly wall panel production at our shop, and looking at your floor panel layout, I see that you've got the main, like the whole floor system, and then there's the individual panel breakouts.
Mm-hmm.
Can you do that with long walls?
Yeah. So if you're talking about actually splitting the wall panels,
Yeah.
there are a few ways to go about that. But the main one that I'm going to point you to is here in the markers. There's a tool here called Split by Rule.
Okay.
Let me just do that on an empty wall, so I'll actually get it to pop up. So with this one, it's definitely the one I like to use the most. You can put in maximum panel lengths, minimum panel lengths. If you need any kind of gaps, that can be controlled with the marker.
Okay.
And that'll automatically break your wall panels.
Okay. And so it's not a matter of, you can't go through the wall and decide where you want to break it, it just does it at those defined integers? So
what that will actually place is a little breakpoint that you can see in a floor plan. And these guys are going to be placed according to that maximum, but if you ever did want to move this around after,
okay.
Regardless if you have panels there or not, they could always be moved. You can regenerate, and the breakpoint will move too.
Okay.
Perfect. If there are any other questions, please take the time now and press the raise your hand button. Otherwise, if you'd like to pose a question through the questions tab of the dashboard, please go ahead with that too. All right, we have another question from Tim. Tim, I'm just going to go ahead and unmute you now. Go ahead, Tim.
I have a question about the split wall panel. If we wanted to split a panel at that location, but we wanted the common stud to essentially overlap the plate by half the thickness of the stud in order to maintain or in order to preserve an extra stud in kind of that wall panel sequence, would we be able to do something like that?
So you want to basically kind of offset your end stud? Is that what I'm understanding?
That is correct.
Sure. Yeah. So once you actually do place the splits, I mean, how it's configured will depend on basically the gap that you have built into here. But what you can do is actually go into the panel's properties. There's an option here specifically for end studs, and this will let you move them. You could always put in an offset directly in here, and you'll be able to move that end stud alone. So it's not going to be directly built into this split option if you want to offset that. But with the split, you could always place at least a gap, and then you can move the end joist, or sorry, the end stud freely with that command.
And then the next panel in that sequence, we would be able to turn off the end stud?
Correct, yeah. There's an option there in the end studs where you can just set it to none. You override that, there's a none option, and it'll be able to turn that off.
Great, thank you.
All right, we'll just take another few seconds or so to see if any other questions come through. All right, perfect. I think that's about a wrap for today. For any questions that have not been answered, we will make sure to get to them by the end of the day today. Once again, I want to thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone who registered for the webinar. I'll now be ending it. Thank you very much. Bye.